Welcome to the January 6th meeting of the Southampton Village, 6th, I believe. 7th, sorry. Welcome to the January 7th meeting of the Southampton Village Planning Commission. So tonight we're going to be talking about the results of the study that's been going on of the zoning in the FEMA zones. But before we start, I want to just give a little bit of prologue to it. So in the last 10 years, we've done, the Planning Commission has recommended to the trustees two significant changes to the zoning code. The first was the zoning in what we call the small lots. And when we analyzed the small lots, we made a decision to move the basic nature of that zoning to what's called a form-based zoning, where we use setbacks and sky exposure planes and the pyramid rule to really try to control how houses were developed in that zone. And then a few years ago, we did a rezoning in the village center, in the business district, and we did a number of things in that rezoning which had to do with use and with parking. But the other thing we did again in the village center is we relied on a form-based zoning so that future buildings that would be constructed in the village center would really fit into the existing pattern that we saw in the village center on Main Street and Jobs Lane. And so in September, I think it was when the mayor and trustees formally asked the Planning Commission to consider the zoning in the FEMA zone. And then in October, I believe, when Nelson Pope was hired to do this study. What we've looked at again is how to use form-based zoning to come up with something in the FEMA zone that would be more in character with what has traditionally been built in Southampton. This is a somewhat different approach, I want to say at the beginning, than what some other villages and towns on the East End have done, where they've relied much more on very strict rules on height and zoning floor area. So we have, over the years, used a somewhat different approach, and I think that's going to be in back of some of what you see tonight. So I will also, just as a caution at the beginning, this is even for those of us who do this all the time, this is a pretty complicated set of recommendations, and I think they fit together fairly well. But what I'd like to do, just so that we can sort of lay the groundwork and get everyone to understand it, is have the consultants first go through the entire set of recommendations, and then we'll go back and go through the slides and let people ask questions as we go along, because I think if you see it as a whole, it'll actually be easier to understand than taking it apart piece by piece. And I will say, when we take questions, I'm going to ask people to come up here and take the microphone so it can be recorded, and obviously, as always, say your name. So, Chick, do you want to start?
Thank you, Paul. My name is Chick Voorhees. I'm with the environmental planning consulting firm Nelson Pope and Voorhees, and we've been the village environmental planning consultants since 2006. And so we're very familiar with issues in the village. We represent the Zoning Board of Appeals on wetlands permits, so have had a lot of involvement with waterfront properties, coastal permits and wetlands permits. We sit and advise the planning board, sit with and advise the planning board, and we've done a number of special projects for the village over the years. So that's kind of the background that we come from. Our firm is based in Melville. We do a tremendous amount of work on the East End. I'm joined by our other team members tonight. Kathy Eisman in the front row here is our Director of Community Planning and has managed many municipal projects. Michael Russo is our Head of Architecture, and he is with the firm Hawkins, Webb & Jaeger, which is an affiliated firm. And he's got tremendous expertise, as you will see, because he will be doing the bulk of the presentation and a lot of the technical aspects of this, and will also be fielding many of the questions. And then Michael Brusso with a B is also our project manager. He's one of our senior planners and has been working on the East End for most of his career. So we feel we have a great team, that we know the village. We were very pleased to be able to kind of interpret the issues as we heard them, as Paul mentioned, from pretty much the charge of the mayor and the trustees and what they have been hearing and some of the issues and problems. So I'll kind of walk you through the approach to the project, a little bit of background, and then we'll get into the recommendations that Mike will present. So we were supposed to have this up while Paul was speaking. And we do have other maps in the back that will represent the study area that I'll talk about in just a moment.
Let me just add one thing. I apologize. But just one thing I would note is we're talking tonight about just the FEMA zone, and you can see the zone on that map on the side of the wall. And we can walk you through that map a little later. It might be helpful in terms of the different areas. Some of the recommendations the consultants will discuss may become things that we may want to do elsewhere in the village, but we want to really focus tonight on just the FEMA zone first, because that's obviously where there's a moratorium and where we think it's most urgent.
Perfect.
Thank you. Okay.
And so this quote is, you won't find this on the internet or in a book. We kind of made it up for the purpose of framing the issue as we saw it tonight. And it's basically that all coastal communities share a hardship of adaptation. And that adaptation is a balance of community character against health, safety, and welfare standards of building and local codes and flood zones, which are enacted to reduce loss of life and property. So it's really, you know, we understand that there's a certain character of the village. We understand that certain elevation requirements have been changed that caused really an effect on how the building code was interpreted. And that's really what we're getting to. And the heart of it basically is the purpose is to provide guidance to the village to maintain a balance of community character with the increasing risks of building within flood zones. So it's a serious situation. There are many manuals, many codes and guidelines and references. Mike will talk about them, but they kind of are incorporated into various parts of the code, as well as other guidance documents at the state level. So, as I kind of alluded to before, the original maps were done in 1983. They were updated in 2009, and that's basically the base flood elevation that's a reference point for building techniques in order to protect structures from flood hazards in the floodplain areas. New construction must be designed to meet or exceed those coastal construction standards, and that stems from the manuals that I referenced before. And that change in the base flood elevation dramatically altered how buildings are designed under the various interpretations of the code. So we believe that there's a need for solutions which preserve the character of the community, and that's what we hope to convey to you tonight. The overall approach involved defining the study area, and as Paul said, it really is the FEMA flood zone areas. We reviewed available data, maps, literature, correspondence, met with John Foster, reviewed building department files, and FEMA requirements as well. And as I said, had already had a good head start on understanding that background. We performed extensive field investigations within the study area to understand exactly what the conditions were. And we performed an inventory and analysis of those existing conditions. We also had a pretty extensive outreach process, mostly involving groups that had expressed special interests. And we'll go through that and give you some of the input that we received, but many of you participated in that. And I'd really like to thank the Planning Commission members who also provided initial insight and really had a grasp to help us get up to speed better and quicker to conduct the project. We evaluated permit application submission requirements, and this is something that's extremely important. It may be kind of a second step, if the board chooses to go ahead with some of the recommendations that we're outlining. But part of the feedback and part of our observation is that what the building department receives, how accurate and thorough it is very important. So we did consider that, as well as an assessment of applications and permit procedures as these projects go through that review process. We reviewed and researched state building code, national reference standards, and zoning codes of other municipalities. We kind of identified ones that we thought would be particularly salient to the study itself, and those are outlined here. And we'll talk about some of the contrasts with those codes. We also, as part of the study, will have a much more detailed matrix of how these heights, massing, and setbacks and so forth of buildings are approached from the various municipalities. But we really isolated the ones that we thought were most important for a presentation this evening to support our recommendations. And we compiled and analyzed, and based on that formulated an approach to bring together this study and identify potential solutions. So same map that's in the back, a little too small to see up here, but you certainly get the picture of pretty much the Barrier Beach area, the Gin Lane area, and the fingers of flood-prone areas that are at lower elevations in the tributary areas and those floodplain areas at the south part of the village. So initially, the mayor was able to provide input from sitting and chairing board meetings where comments were expressed. We met with the chief building inspector, the village attorney, also a very important component, and representatives from the Planning Commission, the ARB, the Zoning Board of Appeals, and the Southampton Association, who has expressed an interest throughout this, this process. Basic issues were, and I'm going to just kind of go through all the bullets of the things that we heard, and then we can kind of check ourselves to show how we have addressed them. We're also going to identify that the charge of this study was really mostly related to building height and massing, and we didn't address everything under the sun with respect to floodplain management. And I think that'll become evident. We had to kind of confine and really address the heart of the matter. So the height of buildings was one of the primary issues that was identified, and it's the actual height as well as the perceived height based on lot size, based on architecture, and the other factors that make up that massing aspect. There was a lot of input with respect to, is it 2.5 story, 3 level, 3.5, and how those facades were really incorporated into the code and interpreted. Bulk and massing of homes, again, actual and perceived, and especially on small lots where, as you approach setbacks and property lines with neighbors, you may have a much greater perceived mass. That was identified as an issue. Difficulty with styles of homes versus perception of height and massing. Some of these overlap a little bit, but we wanted to make sure we accurately collected the input. Loss of privacy from upper floors and view looming over neighboring homes and yards was an issue that was brought out through our outreach. Also screening, planting and screening, and how site design is managed. Excessive impervious surfaces. This may be cases where drainage is potentially impacting adjacent properties or needs to be better managed on a particular property. And that kind of relates to flooding and drainage issues, but from a flooding perspective, it really is because we're in wave energy and base flood elevation zones that in an extreme event, an extreme storm event, water is going to come into those low-lying areas. It also has to recede, and you also have to have capacity to recharge water in areas where it settles. And then a need to refine and streamline the application process, as I said before, things that were sort of on the periphery of the direct study itself, but were identified through our outreach. Comments about loopholes and gray areas. And I think these are things that John Foster, the building inspector, has been struggling with, and certainly need a look and potentially better definition so that applicants and architects can understand truly what the parameters are, and it makes it easier at the building department office level as well. On-site parking issues as it relates to site design, and again, neighboring properties, how fill is managed in those areas was an issue that was identified. And then difference between ocean, bay, and pond lots. As you look at the study area map, we have that variety of different environments. So that was pointed out as a concern. And then finally, protection of property development rights, which we take as a serious aspect of this project. The village, part of its character are the grand homes, some of the larger lots, the ability to have creative and varieties of architectural styles. And, you know, quite honestly, people pay a lot of money for the lots in the village, and they've enjoyed that right. And so now we've identified a problem. We know it's related to changes in the measurement of base flood elevation. And our approach that we'll talk about tonight is how to properly manage that in terms of architectural styling, community character, and also protecting life and loss of property due to floodplain areas. So with that, I'm going to bring Mike Russo up to talk about floodplain basics, and he's going to take you through the remainder of the study.
Yep, thanks. Good evening, everybody. You've heard, I'm going to go through a lot of terms tonight that relate to the whys. I mean, why something has to be that high. You know, just intellectually, it's to stay away from the water. But I want to give you some of the mechanics of when somebody's designing a home, why they choose certain things, and try to separate a measurement of height as a different element than when where the bottom of a house has to be. It's a very important distinction tonight, which I'll go through a few times. So the purpose of FEMA, as you may know, either through the news or whichever, is because it has to do with disaster recovery, rebuilding not only of individual properties, but also of communities. It's the infrastructure of the community. It's also the ability to participate in the insurance program of FEMA. The National Federal Insurance Program, NFIP. The maps, the changes in the maps particularly is that the prior maps were based on the 1929 vertical datum. This was a way of measuring where sea level was in a way that we understood in 1929. Some maps were created. In 1988 was a new datum. They figured there was about, in this area of the United States, about a foot, 1 foot 1, 1 foot 2, somewhere in there is a difference. So something that was elevation 8 is now elevation 9 foot 2, let's say, if nothing else changed, the way they calculate it. Other calculations that have changed since then also is they understand better how to model. Obviously with GPS, with satellites, recording of events, having better records of events, more buoys, all these other things. They can, the predictability of storms, also the action of when water comes in, what does it do to the land? The strength of the wave, the mass of water that's behind an individual wave, not just the height of the wave. So all of these things have been recalculated and created these new maps. The image that you have behind there and that Chick had showed you earlier. So some of the terms that we're going to refer to tonight is like a VE zone. A VE zone is when a property has water action coming in that is the wave is greater than 3.5 feet. A wave that is greater than 3.5 feet has more volume, more power behind it. It goes further inland. It does more destruction. A coastal AE zone is where there still is wave action, but the wave action is anywhere from 18 inches to 3.5 feet. And then you have a coastal A zone, or an A zone, where it's 18 inches or less. Currently, as a rule of thumb, generally speaking, when you're dealing with wave action areas, which the bulk of your properties that are on this map identified here in our study area, is the underside of structure where the beams, any horizontal beams, not obviously the thing that's holding up the beam, but the beam itself is about 2 feet above the top of the wave action. General rule of thumb. I'm going to use some generalisms today. What we did here on the left slide, this is an area that is just to the east of Cooper's Neck Pond. On the old map, it was considered elevation 8. The same spot on the new map is now elevation 14. Wow. Okay, that is just one example of an area that there is more extreme areas than this. So part of, as Chick and Paul had talked about, is about mass. Mass has to go somewhere. If it's not down on the ground and it has to be elevated, it's going to be up in the air. So we're going to talk about this form-based solution, about how mass is managed. It doesn't reduce, make a house smaller in square footage, but it's how the mass is organized, how it is more architecturally pleasing, how facades and panels and things and all these different things articulate. So it's all different types of styles of homes. Everything kind of works. But as our recommendations are going to show you, the mass is lower and then it gets smaller as it goes higher. General principle. So part of what Chick had said is we did a study of neighboring communities. If you take a look on the right-hand side, we have two columns, inland and in the floodplain. At the top, there's a diagram of the village of Southampton. Inland, or that town center area, already utilizes a pyramid or sky plane, somewhat interchangeable. You'll hear both today. In the floodplain area, as you can see, there's a straight line. 30 feet back, there's a vertical plane. You could build anything in that vertical plane. So as you come up with a property, the whole house just shifts straight up. And I have some other diagrams that are going to show you in more detail the impact of how that straight line applies to the potential design of a house. The town of Southampton uses sky plane, both inland and on the floodplain area. The town of East Hampton does the same thing. On the left-hand side, we listed a few other villages. We have Sagaponack, town of East Hampton, village of East Hampton, and obviously ours. Something that's very important. Some of these other villages and towns, if you can imagine, you have a height of a building and you have the ground level. And if you're in an inland area, right now we're talking about 35 feet. In a floodplain, that 35 feet just gets relocated up higher. The ground doesn't change. The street doesn't change. That just goes up. In other towns, you take that dimension, whether it be 32 feet or 35 feet, and then you come up with where the measurement doesn't change. Your height never changes. So you have less house to build. Okay, so part of our study was to understand what other communities that have similar characteristics do. This, in our opinion, was a bit on the draconian side. It reduces the house size. Our study is about mass, the perception of mass, and the type of architecture that gets designed. Okay. So what we did here was we created this fictitious home to illustrate a couple of points. This home does not exist within the village. It is not anybody's particular house. It is just something that illustrates. One thing that we found out, as Paul said earlier, it is not one item that fixes this. It is not one individual piece that is the solution. It is the combination of all these different opportunities that provide architects and engineers creative solutions for whatever it is that they want to do to meet their clients' needs. Okay? So it's this comprehensive approach, this whole project design. What you see here is, if you could take a look on the left-hand side, what we took is about a 150-foot wide lot, as an example. It falls within the average. Average lots within this area is about 125 to about 280. So we kind of shot one somewhere there so the picture wasn't too wide. 30-foot width setback on the sides, so that is uniform on both sides. On the left-hand side, as you can see, when we drove around, we saw that there was a lot of properties that were terraced, whether it be terraced by berms or terraced by retaining walls, whatever way, that adds to the visual or perceived mass of a house. If that is further inland, it's not up close to the neighbor, it's not up close to the person on the street walking by, whatever the case may be. So we broke our approach into understanding the three different massing elements that go into the perception of the height or massing of a house. On the left-hand side, you'll see that all the way on the left, right underneath the dimensions, is a 6-foot man, or woman, or person. Okay, thank you. Or zombie. The double terraces that are planted in front, and then you have this terraced area. So from that side, not only are they seeing raised property, but they're all seeing a 2.5-story mass at the top of that. On the other side of the property, you'll see another neighbor off the property. There's some planting in front of it. Thank you, Chick, my assistant. But on the other side, because of the garage under, utilizing that space for parking underneath the house, that is because the house is raised, a 3.5-story mass. So from the neighborhood perspective, particularly the next door neighbor, there's a 2.5-story with some terrace or walls or berms or whatever it might be. On the other side, there's a 3.5-story mass. This is bulk. And this is what we're really focusing on, the bulk and perceived height and massing of a building. So some of our recommendations are going to address how to deal with the ground level, that bottom level of massing, the perception of how close that mass is to the property lines, and how it gets articulated to get up to the height that it needs to get. Some of our recommendations are going to address the facade itself, the articulation of the facade, how wide a panel can be, how tall a panel can be. Doesn't matter what material it is, doesn't matter what style of architecture it is, but maximums before you have a plane break, whether it be above or below or to the sides. Doesn't push one type of architecture or another, but it just has to do with that it breaks the eye. It stops the eye. It creates more creative architecture, you could say, too, because a lot of the houses that we've seen, as we've done all of our dashboard surveys as well as going through records, we've probably went through 20, 30, 40 houses in records. A lot of the things that we're recommending are already utilized in the home design. That's very, very important. We're looking to reinforce things that have already considered as successful projects and understanding the scale of the properties. These are large lot recommendations through these areas. And we're looking to make the design professionals, maybe one of them, design professionals, that they're coming in with understanding a more predictable path to get what they need for their client. The house can still remain the same square footage. That's not a concern. This is something that is important to the community as a community asset here. It's not about square footage. It's about how that volume is used and where it is as it relates to the community, to the property lines. The next two items about building mass and height. These two items, not only about the facades and things like that, but also as the roof relates to that, the type of roof, how the roof mass comes down and around, whether it's a return gable or a hip roof or a gambrel or a flat roof or whatever the case may be. These are all different elements, but when you combine the two, one does have a relationship to the other, and we have to address it. And then, of course, like I just said about the roof types, flat roof, pitch roof, type of pitch roof, how the volumes below relate to the roof design, water flows downhill. So, there are things that are just elemental that will stay uniform as the project gets developed. Potential solutions. From our research, from understanding the perception, as well as some of the successful projects within the village, we've come up with some things that hopefully will lead towards the things that the Planning Commission wants to reinforce. One is about, we found that there was, I don't want to say a vague or a gray, but uniform building height measurement as it relates to flood zones. Again, everything that I'm saying is in relationship to flood zones. So we did a little bit of analysis, which I'll get to tell you how we came about our recommendations. Requiring minimum roof pitch. So if you can imagine that you have a wall of a house and then you have a roof that's sitting on top of that, coming down on it, if it's a pitch roof. The pitch of that roof, you'll be restrained with the roof of building height. If you have a minimum pitch, then the spot where the wall ends and it goes into the roof, those planes intersect. If there's a higher pitch, that'll push that line a little bit down, so the facade won't seem as tall. Again, it's about perception. Pyramid and sky plane law. By developing criteria specifically for the large lots and the unique lots that Chick has pointed out, that the bay side of Meadow has a more narrow lot because of the wetlands, whereas on the south side of Meadow, you have longer lots, and you're contending with a dune line definition setback versus actual wetland setbacks. So there's all different types of, you have narrow lots, wide lots, all these different things. So we have different recommendations for that. One of the other things that we noticed, though, also is the style of homes that were deemed, for lack of a better term, palatable, tasteful, the homes that the village is known for, whether it be contemporary or unique or traditional, whatever it might be, that there should be an opportunity to break that sky plane for unique features, so that you don't have to keep going back to the zoning board if you want to put a small dormer on a reverse or something like that. So we'll go through that as well. Developing facade articulation requirements, improved definition of stories, vertical and horizontal dimensional restrictions. This gets into more form-based. Maximum width of a panel, maximum height of a panel, how one panel relates to another. These are all pieces that will come into play in our recommendations. And as Paul said earlier, and I've said again, all of these are basic ways of describing form-based solutions. The form of the building. It's about architecture. It's not whether or not there's an imaginary wall that you can't build past. It's about encouraging good architecture that this community is known for. Additional solutions. Restricting side yard, front yard grading. There's two benefits. Being in a floodplain, water has to go somewhere. Water has to be able to come in, and water has to come out. There's a lot of other aspects to this that we'll recommend some further study on. But if, like that diagram that I had before, if those walls and those berms are not right up against the property, the perception of that mass is that if it's more gentle. What we noticed is that some of the lots that had this much more gentle approach to getting up to that higher level of where you enter in the home was more palatable to the eye, that the community enjoyed it more. There wasn't as many, nobody was outraged over those things, whereas the ones that had these walls that were a couple feet off the property line seemed to be harder on the eye. They're less characteristic of the norm of the community. Restrictions on maximum impervious surface coverage. As Chick said before, water has to go somewhere. So we'll be recommending standards for maximum surface of impervious, so that when water falls on the property, it doesn't that it has to run off. It can actually allow it to get into the property. And that it's that balance of what you need to get in and out of your property, to park cars, for terraces, whatever it might be, balancing that against having the opportunity for water to naturally recharge, or flood water to just seep in rather than flood water rush off the property and then maybe take out your neighbor's property across the street, okay, which we can talk about more. And the adoption of and enforcement of floodplain management construction methodology, which I'll talk to you about a little bit more later. So our recommendations. Uniform building measurement. One of the things that we found, and if there are any design professionals in the audience, hopefully you guys, I guess, you all will follow along with me. We found that if you were building an inland lot, the point of measurement of building height is 35 feet from the average grade around the foundation. If you think about it, which is the lower diagram, thank you, Chick. The lower diagram, you have a foundation wall that comes up. The state code tells you how high, as a minimum, you need to have between soil and the top of that. Then you have some top plates, which is wood, and then you have wood framing, and then you have the floor. The person on an inland lot, we felt, has 1 foot less benefit in building height than somebody in the floodplain. Because currently, not codified, but currently, the way that it is reviewed is that building height, not construction, not underside construction, building height is measured from base flood elevation +2. So one of our recommendations is to make it only for the measurement of building height is 35 feet from BFE +1. So it's uniform. It's uniform from a inland lot to a lot that is out in the flood zone. Okay, this is, 1 foot is not the biggest difference in the world, but it's making things uniform as it relates to when you're standing outside of a house and you're standing on the soil and you're looking at a 35-foot tall house. They're uniform between being inland or being waterside. Does everybody, just want to make sure that everybody's clear on that.
That means you're still starting at base flood
+2.
First floor.
Your undersided structure is still base flood plus 2.
And you just take it
But-
to 35
I
foot
can't
back.
hear that. That's not going to work if you're going to make a question.
Mike, I really think
Okay, I
you
apologize.
should
I'll
go
go
through.
Yeah,
I'll
why
do
don't we go
questions
through
later.
it and we'll go
I
back. so
apologize.
that
We'll
everyone
hold
can
that
see.
till later. Sorry about that. Okay. Regulating mass. So we found that there were some architectural masses that did not have definition in the code that will make some recommendations on how to define them. Okay, it's just definitions. So that when architects do make a submission, they label things as accurate and things like that. The minimum roof pitch. We talked about it before. Steeper the roof brings down the top plate height of the second floor a bit, which brings down the height of that wall. That wall is closest to your neighboring properties. Half stories. Revising how the third floor is defined. And I'm saying third floor because it's really that half story. People are actually walking through that half story in many of the applications. We're making this more in concert with actually the way the state code references it, because the state building code is actually defines it a certain way, and we're just tying it to the state code definition. The facade articulation, reducing the single mass of large walls. We talked about this a few times already. There's two definitions of the height of the wall, the width of the wall, and how the walls have to be to one another. Minimum dimensions of offset. The goal, and I'll explain the diagrams in a moment, the goal is that the highest points of the home are towards the center of the home, not at the edges. Okay, that is the goal, which we'll get into when we talk about sky plane. You'll see a little bit more of that evidence. The diagrams on the right are just showing you 3 different scenarios that we have noticed of construction in the village. So when somebody does have a half story, it's usually within the roof line. Sometimes they'll have some dog houses, they'll have some eyebrow windows, something like that. It would be up there, and there'd be limitations on that. On some homes, we noticed that the second floor would be cathedral ceilings or trade ceilings, things like that. So that's how that all fits in. And then the third would be maybe a single-story space that might be excessively tall, whatever shape it might be. The lines that you see at the bottom is this grade plane, which is the BFE. This gets into new definitions, which I can explain a little bit later. The second dashed line is the flat roof, 27 feet. And then the third one is currently maximum ridge height. The maximum ridge height of 52 feet is a worst case scenario when you take one of the highest VE zone and you add 35 feet to it. Okay, sky plane. For those that, I'm assuming that most people do understand it, but sky plane is a ratio of the rise, vertical dimension, to the horizontal dimension. That would be a diagonal line, and that diagonal line would be that the mass of a house has to be within that mass. Pyramid is a little bit of a misnomer because it's not really a pyramid, but it's a volume that you can design your home within. Some of our recommendations also include that you can pierce that with certain architectural features no greater than certain dimensions and things like that. So you don't have to keep running to the zoning board when the style of a home needs or should have a certain style of dormer or architectural feature or something. So things that we noticed. Our examples here are on Meadow Lane. Our recommendations for the pyramid would be a 33-degree sky plane. This is different than the small lot sky plane. The sky plane that you currently are using is a 45-degree sky plane. It's on smaller lots. If you can imagine that the 45 degrees allows a house that's closer to the side yard. In the larger lots, when you have 30-foot setback, having a more shallow, because the lots are so large, having a more shallow sky plane works. One of the other pieces is our suggestion, our recommendation on minimum roof pitch for a pitched roof, would be an 8-on-12. It fits into 33 degrees as well. So it's instead of having these weird pieces that you're not able to utilize to maximize your volume, you actually can end up using your volume up as you need. One of the things we noticed also is that the The 80-foot setback along the south side makes a lot of sense. On the north side of Meadow, there's some historic, beautiful homes that need to be raised. These houses should be further away from the wetlands, so some of our recommendations may also include a little bit of relaxation to the front yard setback and how the sky plane is reflective of that, so that the north side of Meadow, as you're going further west, will have a uniformity to its setbacks and the sky planes and things like that, so that it can get further away from the wetlands. Keep in mind, when wave action comes into this area, the waves and water come from the bay. They don't get over the top of the dunes. Like, there's a couple of dune breaks that I think are going to be repaired over by the church and some other areas where water may be able to get through. But from a community planning standpoint, the water is coming from the bay. So water has to get back through. Water has to get back through, back out to the bay. On Meadow Lane, we just talked about, we're making recommendations on narrow lots as well. So on a narrow lot, for example, the sky plane on the side yard would be slightly different than a large lot. So that because there are a small handful of narrow lots on Meadow or within the study area, we made some minor adjustments that allow for a uniformity of how the houses step back and look. This diagram illustrates the house that we had before in our examples. And if you notice, the red striped areas is the volume that our sample house took up. Thank you. This greenhouse in the front shows you an example of how the planes are step back. As you go up higher, the plane breaks. Okay, there's a couple different ways to do it. Removing the masses, getting that close to the side property line, allowing water to get in and out, which I'll talk about in a moment. A few more steps to get into the house as well, rather than being right on plane. You can still park underneath the building. But if you take a look at this sky plane, which is that diagonal line, if everybody can see it, thank you, you'll see that the bulk of that perceived 2.5-story mass facing the side yard, the neighbor, and the bulk of that 3.5-story mass facing the neighbor is cut. It's cut down over more than a full story. It doesn't reduce the square footage. It cuts out the perception of where the volume stands. Again, going back to that diagram early in the beginning, there was that straight line that buildings can go right up to. We're looking to cut that top off on an angle. This example is just a quick sketch on understanding the before and after facade articulation. It's not to dictate a certain style of home, it's just a sample house. Basically, before you have this big 2.5-story mass that, I'll shift over, this big 2.5-story mass without any plane breaks, and then on the right-hand side, there's a relief by having a plane break. Okay? Just so everybody understands what plane break means. This here are examples of one of thousands of solutions. These particular examples are way that some of the homes are already designed here in the village. Part of our recommendations will include that the higher you go up on the side, the floor has to reduce. The mass has to reduce as you go up. It's not throughout the whole building. It's a certain distance coming in. So if you do want to have that two-story element on the side, it has to reduce as you go higher. Not that it's a big A or something like that, but like these examples, you have a gambrel end or a gable end. Again, these are styles on homes that are already revered within the community. Within a certain distance coming into the house, that's where that mass can be. Again, it just reduces the perceived mass and encourages the architecture that is already revered within the village. Drainage and flooding. I touched a little bit about this before. Some of our recommendations are going to reduce the amount of volume of how the property can be lifted closer to the property lines. For example, part of our recommendations is that there'll be a certain percentage of impervious on the side yard. There'll be a primary side yard and a secondary side yard. The secondary side yard will have less allowable impervious. The primary side yard will, because a lot of side entrance garages, one side should have it, not both sides to have the same amount. The front yard, same thing. If you're impervious going almost all the way up to the street, water has to go somewhere. So part of our recommendations is going to be that there's a certain amount of property that has to remain with less than 2 feet of elevation change, so water can go somewhere. When there is, whether there's a deluge rain, whether there's flood water can go somewhere to get in before the property rises. We're making recommendations on maximum slope of non-structural fill. Whether it be a heavy rain, whether it be a flood event, water is going to take earth away. If the slope is too steep, can't be stabilized, it's going to be there'll be escarpments, there'll be removal of soils, and it'll cause more damage. Sometimes those areas might be supporting terraces, driveways, tennis courts, whatever it might be. If the slope allows for a little bit of run-up, without as much damage to it, there's a better chance that the improvements will remain intact. Limiting the use of retaining walls and berms. I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but generally speaking, there's a lot of retaining walls, but I think I've kind of hit on this a few times already about where they're used, the distance from one retaining wall to the next retaining wall, the limit on the height of the retaining walls, all these different things, plus how they get designed. We're going to address some of those standards as well. This image we showed you before, if you take a look at the two areas on the bottom left and the bottom right, is to relax that slope closest to the property lines, to the sides. So it stays more natural, no more than 2 feet of increase. So when water does come onto the property, it has a place to recharge without going into a neighbor's property. And same thing for area for, if you can think about this as an aggregate, one house after another, now you have double that width between houses for water to go to. Flood waters can get in, and they'll have a better chance of getting back out. This chart illustrates what the issues are in general terms: building height, building mass, building setbacks, and site grading and fill. Our recommendations, in very general terms, we have 5 recommendations that are to be combined. Establishing about how the grade plane and measurement gets handled, the pyramid law of the sky plane, facade articulation, architectural features, and side yard grading. So from a building height standpoint, grade plane, pyramid, architectural features, and side yard address helping deal with the mass and size of that mass of a house. Building mass itself, we hit all 5 points that we're recommending. We'll hit upon helping with the relief that these grand homes don't also have oversized facades, that things step back. So building setbacks, pyramid law, and the side yard grading address that. And for site grading and fill problems, both pyramid and side yard grading address that. As Chick outlined in the beginning, we heard a lot of information. Some information was not directly related to building mass or building height. Other items that do need to be considered after this study is concluded is the issue of on and off street parking. We heard a lot of issues about a lot of cars on the street in a lot of places. Some of that relates to certain elements within the zoning code on parking stalls, not parking stalls, but room for parking, depending on as a calculation of bedrooms, standards for minimum driveway width. And then on the flip side, you're also we make recommendations limiting how much coverage you can have in the front yard. So it can't have all driveway. Floodplain management standards, we talked about that a little bit. Planting and screening standards, maximum slope over drainage and septic systems. This goes back to that you are in a flood area. So when the water comes in, the water is going to take soil away from it. When you're under a certain slope, you have a better chance of being able to maintain those systems as stable. Flood proofing, sanitary systems from discharging into roads and adjacent properties during floods. If you scour out the soil that is where next to a cesspool, that stuff has to go somewhere too. So we want to make sure that that the village, as we recommend, the village does get further into that study of that. Retaining wall berm standards, certification of design to resist scour, floodplain structures, structural standards, and uniform and predictable standards for applications and documents. This is something that's very important. As we go through all of our recommendations, we're also making recommendations to the village on on assisting these gray areas and loopholes. For example, part of our recommendations is a standard way of preparing a survey. So when a survey comes in, there's a handful of very responsible land surveyors, but if somebody from another that hasn't worked in this community, there should be a document that says this is the standard, how the grades get taken, how often they get taken, and the certifications that need to be on there, so that the design professional has accurate information to base their design on. That's one of the things. Also, the predictable process. Understanding very clearly from the beginning the permit process. It comes into here, it goes into John. John has some criteria that the applications have to meet, and it's easier for him to get through. The easier it is for this man to do his job, the easier it is for the permit process to happen. So we're going to be assisting John with clearing up how those application paths to make it more predictable, both for the homeowner and the design professionals. Next steps. Want me to go through that, Chick, or do you?
Yeah, you can continue.
Okay. So next steps. We're going to consider the input and recommendations and revise as appropriate. I believe we want, I'll say it again, all comments would be in by January 30th, and I'll give you contact information at the end of the slides. January 30th by close of business to the village. We have a contact email for that. Tonight is to the introduction of the recommendations. There'll be public input. There'll be input from the boards. We'll collect that information after the 30th, and then we'll give a final draft of what we recommend to the Planning Commission. We will address the application submission procedural requirements, uniform predictability, and consistency of review process solutions, forms, diagrams, survey standards, submission standards, checklists, and application procedures. We'll complete the project task, prepare the report, and we will present recommendations to the village trustees. So,
Wave hi, Steve.
hi, Steve. So we'll start questions and answers in a moment, but all comments need to be received by the village by January 30th, by close of business. It'll go to Steve Funch. Am I saying your name right? Okay. Okay. Village admin at southamptonvillage.org. Okay. And when you do make comments, if anything that you can give us, any recommendation is valid and valuable. If you can give us a little bit of perspective, whether it be about a particular home or a view or something. It's not to turn somebody else out on it, but it gives us an opportunity to understand your viewpoint and what you're basing it on. Not, I like this, I don't like that. Give us constructive information, because it really helps us as planners to be able to make the best recommendations that works for the village to move forward. Thanks.
Okay, so we're going to take questions. I'm actually going to start with members of the Planning Commission first, and then members of the audience, and I think we will join in trying to answer. Anybody in the Planning Commission have anything they want to say before we go to the general audience? Okay, so other quick questions. And to start? Oh, yeah, or can you just take this in, please? I hate to do this, but can you identify yourself?
Okay, Melissa Dedovich. My question actually of two is, number one, on the BFE plus one. Just to confirm that your first floor elevation, your finished first floor is where it is. And in essence, what you're doing then is making a 35-foot house, a height, instead of a 35-foot house, it's a 34-foot house.
Correct.
Okay. The second question I have is, where is the sky plane taken from? You said 33 degrees. Where is that taken from?
I'll go to that diagram.
Thank you.
Okay, so for example, And actually, this is actually giving me an opportunity to punctuate something that I did not talk about before.
Mike, you have the
On an 80-foot setback lot.
it, Mike.
Thanks.
As well.
Great, okay. On an 80-foot setback lot, it is taken at this new defined line, which is BFE +1, is the horizontal aspect of it. Front yard. Okay, that is a uniform spot to measure. 40 feet in is where you come up with the 33 degrees. Then you have, of course, your front yard setback, which tells you where your front plane of the house can be. Okay, so you have 40 feet. Then you have 33 degrees. You still have your 80-foot setback. But what's kind of interesting about that dimension right there, of where the front wall turns into roof, the plane change, is 27 feet, which is also your limit of height for a flat roof building. So there's now a similarity between that mass, whether it be a flat building or a pitch roof building.
And if you work it back at 8 on 12, where do you land?
Right. 8 on 12 is a little over 33 degrees, so you can fill that volume. You have a question?
And let me also just, before we get to the next one, just so part of the thought here is, so, in Southampton, well, we certainly, and very, very much when we, part of the process here in the last few months has been what houses in this area does everyone think have been good and successful houses, and many of them fall within this model, which is really how this model was derived. Mm-hmm. However, I want to emphasize this. If you want to build a flat-roofed house, there's nothing in this that will stop you from doing that. What you will be doing when you build a flat-roofed house is you can't get to the same height as you would if you did a more traditional style house. So it's your choice as a homeowner to decide what style of house you want to do and how you want to use the volume. So in effect, if you're going to build a single-story house, you're going to not be able to go as high, and you're going to choose to spread the mass more at a lower level, which we think from a neighbor's point of view makes it have much less impact than a flat roof house that is much higher.
Let me add to
Right,
that.
right.
Keep in mind, a flat roof house, as you currently have it, is 27 feet. We're not making any recommendations to the change of 27 feet.
Right.
It's still, right. Correct. We're not making any recommendations to change that. And if you can understand this piece right here, that's the 27 feet.
Right.
So whether it's a pitch roof house or a flat house, that's still the same mass.
But actually, it's 26 feet. If you do a BFE +1.
That's correct.
Right, right.
That's correct.
Right.
That was my question, on that
Okay.
diagram.
Can you just
Sorry.
identify yourself?
My name is Jerry Hupy.
I can hear him on the other.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm trying to talk loud.
You're easy to
I just wanted to clarify that the datum line that you're basing the 40-foot setback and then the 33-foot pyramid law, and also that 27-foot height you're describing, is that BFE or is that BFE plus?
It's BFA +1.
+1.
That's
Okay.
correct. That's correct.
Side yard also?
Side yard, no, it's a 5-foot vertical offset, and then the sky plane Thank you for asking. At the property line. Thank you for asking.
Hi there, Neil Smith. This is just an understanding question. Sorry, Charlie. How's that? How's that? Good. Just an understanding question, really. One of the most contentious buildings in the Village of Light was 40 Meadow Lane. I think everybody's heard of 40 Meadow. I think that's V17. So I just want to figure out how high the house would be allowed under the new recommendations on the 40 Meadow Lane site. And just to be clear, I think I've got it right. If it's V17, first of all, there's 2 feet elevation allowed, which isn't there to start with, right, by just fill. Then from the top of that fill, you can go, I think it's V17 plus 1, which is 18, and then you add 35 to that. Is that putting that house in the 50 plus 50 foot range?
I'll define that
Okay,
for you a
thanks.
little bit. let me just,
because
what
it's VE 17, I just want to know how high that house would be under your recommendation.
okay, so one of the things that just keep in mind when we're talking about where things are dimensioned from and the relationship of BE, that is to sea level. So natural grade in that area might be 7. So you're starting from 7 is where you're standing in the street at 7. So the datum of perception, you're not at 0, you're at 7.
So you say 7 feet plus 35 feet.
No, I'm gonna.
Just wait for the answer.
Okay, just wait for it. All right. I'm not Spielberg, but I'll get there. All right, so the perception of where you stand is, obviously depends on if you're in 4, 5, 6, 7. Depends on what natural grade is.
Let's call it 8 feet.
We'll say it's 8. We'll say 8 feet is natural.
Yeah.
Part of recommendations is that within a certain area around the property, you cannot raise the grade more than 2 feet. That is because of floodwaters and being able to keep water on your property as natural recharge areas. Also, to push back the soil volume, or what you need to hold that soil, further into the property. Okay, so you can get a natural berm coming up, or if you do use a retaining wall, it's further into the property. Okay, so that is
10 feet.
where I'm going with it. Nope, I'm saying that has no bearing. I want to take that 2 feet out
Okay.
from this equation. If the house is at VE 17, okay, that means the underside of structure is at 19. The house potential height of the house would be taken at BFE plus 1. So it's 18 plus the potential of 35. But wait there. I'm sorry? No. So when you take a house that is your relative dimension of building height, everybody's at 8. Everybody's standing at 8 at this point. Okay? So the dimension from 8 to the underside of structure is 11 feet. So we'll say the ceiling of the garage is at 11 feet. But the building height is dimensioned from 10 feet. All right? We'll call it VE 17 plus 1, BFE plus 1. That's the potential height. But because of the accumulative other pieces, roof pitch, maximum the plane breaks, the volume, you're not going to have a wall that is that height of building. So the highest point of a potential house on that lot, and I didn't do the math, I'm just kind of throwing it out for example, and it is something that we could probably look at if the Planning Commission wants us to, is the highest point of the house is in the middle of the site. It's no longer at the edge of the site, but from what I understand, on that parcel, there was also side yard variances as well, which brought it closer. And there wasn't any facade articulation law that said as you go up, you have to break the planes so that your smaller masses are on your second floor, and then if there happens to be enough room between the roof pitch and everything else, whether there's any half-story ability in the middle for a widow's peak or whatever the case may be. So it's hard to say the number, because when you figure out your maximum width on the side yard, like a 30 foot, and once you bring that up and you come up 75%, there's a couple of things. Like Paul had mentioned and Chick had mentioned, it's complex to figure out what you're allowed to do the first time. After you get it, and that's why the diagrams are very important, the cheat sheets that we're going to make are very important, because once you get to that point, it's going to be very easy to understand how high something can be. On average, we did a on average type of disposition. Unless somebody has a cupola, unless somebody has a widow's peak, which would be a feature that would be towards the center of the house, not at the edge of the house, where when we had gotten an understanding, when we did our dashboard survey, the houses that seemed to be perceived as most offensive is with the houses that were right at that 30-foot line and had 3.5 stories of wall. Those were the houses that seemed most offensive, most towering, most impinging upon looking into somebody else's property type of thing. So again, the sky plane, facade articulation, steps a house as it goes up. So on our hypothetical house, we are averaging, without the cupola, without some unique feature in the middle of the house, you're probably talking about houses hitting 44 to 46 feet rather than hitting the 52.
But then...
But it's an architectural solution.
I
Yeah,
understand.
okay.
That's good, thank you. Follow-up question. Then, if that was allowed to be what I calculate as 45 feet above grade under the new regulations, you then said it would have to be 33 feet skyflame, but then you said not if it's, 33 degrees skyflame, not on a narrow lot. That's a narrow lot. So is there relief for a narrow lot that still allows it to be 45 feet high at its highest point?
Between the different elements, and again, I can, if the planning commission wants us to, I'll look at that during the review during the public commentary process, because I'd like to be able to give you a truthful answer based upon the real geometry of the site. Unfortunately, we didn't prepare it. We weren't asked to necessarily look at any particular house and kind of beat it up. But it was a good example of a house that, because there wasn't certain regulations like skyplane, facade articulation, like our recommendations, it had the ability to only need a side yard variance, I guess is the best way to say it. It wasn't asking for 10 variances. It was asking for 1 or 2. That was it. So,
Right. Another way of answering it, it's a very good. What you're asking is certainly a very good thing, and something that we're really focusing on. So I guess number one, we generally have asked them not to look at individual applications, which has always been our policy when we do zoning. In part because this is zoning that has to work for the next 10 to 20 years. So we don't want to do zoning based on one house and then be back here 2 years later because we find. But generally, let me put it in more general terms. To do a house on that type of lot, you would generally, under this new zoning, come up with a very different form. Because the house would basically, from the sides, set back, and it might reach a fairly good height at one point. What you would not have under this form-based zoning is a house that is at that height throughout the whole bulk. And the reason I think why we're going in that direction is if you think of the houses on the ocean, if you will, that everyone loves and are great houses, that's what they do. Which, if you look at what people did at the turn of the last century, not this current century, that's what they did, is they basically did houses that did this, and no one really had a problem with them, and we consider them great houses. What's happening in these more recent houses is they're filling out the bulk. So you have these houses that are almost like a box. And basically, under this new zoning, you couldn't build that box. That's what you would not be able to do. And that's generally the direction we've taken, and I think that has most impact actually in the narrow lots, where you really now have in the last few years seen houses that basically box out and come very close to the neighbors on both sides. So that's been the direction I think we're going in with this zoning, is trying to in effect, if you will, recreate the traditional form that you used to see.
I agree with that. The only reason I was using the example was just to understand.
Yeah, and I think it's a very good point, and we might follow up and ask Nelson Pope to come out to do a few more drawings so we can see how it would actually play out on a typical narrow lot. Let's put it that way.
But you said the issues are on narrow lots. Is the relief on a narrow lot? Because if there's a relief on a narrow lot, then you...
No. Let's go to someone who didn't ask. Yeah.
I have a question. Mine's a conceptual question. I mean, this whole issue came up because of the houses on narrow lots and the massing, et cetera, et cetera. Why are we creating this zoning now for all the lots and all the sizes? That is, the larger lots probably do not present the problem even under present zoning. So why are we applying this all across the board? Or should we limit it only to certain size lots?
generally speaking, as Chick said right in the beginning of the presentation, it's a community issue. It's not one lot issue, it's a community issue. The zoning board looks at items as a individual application, what they're asking for, what they can do, and they use their discretion as the village codes allowed them to use their discretion. And then you have the planning, and you have A or B, and all this other stuff. Going after the property that is single and separate, that is underneath an average lot size, a narrow lot, is not the solution for having voids and gray areas in the code. There are voids and gray areas in the code. if you lived further west from that house, and somebody could build a 3.5-story house 30 feet from your property line, you might get offended. So the study is about uniformity throughout this whole area, so that in community planning, as Paul said, it's not as much about a 10-year issue. Community planning, you're looking at 30 to 50 years of trying to come up with something that works to advance a community and development. If you look at the houses that have been replaced, those houses are 60 to 80 years old or more. So it's decisions today that will assist in making this community stronger as it relates to floodplain management, development in floodplain areas, as well as the regulation of bulk to a property line.
And let me just add, just because so if you have a very large lot, certainly I think the major impact of this is going to be you're going to put that house in the middle of the lot so that you're not as impacted by these rules. And from our point of view, that's a good thing, right? Because even though you could have a very large lot and still under current zoning, you could have a very large lot, have a 5-acre lot, a 10-acre lot, and put the house right at the corner of the lot, and there'd be nothing stopping you from doing that. And so you'd have the same impact on a neighbor as in a small lot. So what we're really doing, I think, is addressing the fact that the current code as the FEMA zone is making houses get higher, we just don't have anything in the current zoning that really addresses that, either in small or large lots.
Yeah, but these sky planes will affect adversely houses on large lots, because you won't be able to pretty much build what they have right now, and right now they're not having an impact.
Yeah, let me just point something out here. On the side yard, on a large lot, that is, now I need to see. You still have a 30-foot setback. The mass of that 30-foot setback, how high that mass can be, is what the sky plane regulates. More often than not, on a large lot, the house is more than 30 feet away from its side yard. So
You still have that vertical flexibility.
So this house, if you have a large lot, that point where the sky plane hits your maximum height, right there, that's where your house could be. Your house could be 100 feet in. On the 6-acre lots, could be anything. You don't have to comply with the sky plane to 100 feet in.
That doesn't affect you.
That's right. Sky plane is to relax the bulk closest to your neighbors.
Mark? Yeah.
But do you believe that there should be another set of regulations for existing homes that will be raised at the location where they are, and when raised, they may then pierce that sky plane?
I don't know of any particular property. I do know of there's a house that's on the north side of Meadow that is a chateau style, right? Beautiful home, beautiful home. Very close to the road as well. The house is not 35 feet tall on its own. So even if that house got raised, it's still not 35 feet tall. Okay, so the nature of anything that can go into the zoning board is they look at the circumstances that are there, and if somebody wants to raise in that place, if the planning board wants us to look at some type of coming up with some language for some uniformity to houses that are not adding on, they're not doing anything else, they'll covenant that they're not putting a second floor on top if it's a one-story home. There could be all these different mechanisms that the village could develop that can grandfather a location of a home, so that if it's raised. Now, one thing that's also kind of that's interesting is it's being exercised much further west from here. Is the flood insurance program? If you don't raise your house, you may not be able to participate in the insurance program. If you raise your house and you go to the minimum, that's a good, relatively term. It's a good rate. But if you go BFE plus 3, it's the cheapest rate. So they're giving benefit to the property owners, and I would assume that if you have a very large home, that the insurance break by having one less foot of ceiling height somewhere in the house, in general, might give you cheaper insurance. But I don't think that's a real concern here. Maybe generally speaking, but there are incentives for BFE plus 3. But there are incentives through the National Insurance Program, and some of the old homes could benefit from that. Is my point. Because some of these
I don't know
old
if the question was answered directly, but really, as it stands now, we haven't differentiated between raising existing homes.
yeah.
And as Mike said, you know, if there is a unique circumstance where it does make sense, but you'd pierce the sky plane, you could go to the zoning board of appeals and, you know, make a rational case for that. But we didn't see any reason to separately identify this.
Right.
We think that these standards, you know, should apply wherever they possibly can.
Let me make
for the
one
purpose
more
of
statement with
reducing
that.
mass.
Let me make one more statement. The sky plane does not encourage people to knock down old homes. It doesn't at all. There are two separate items, at all. There's a home that is worthy up to the homeowner, not worthy to the community, to themselves, and they want to raise that house. It is up to the nature of how they apply for it and what they're asking for relief from. And I don't know of many communities that have said no to being able to meet the floodplain criteria to raise the home.
Okay. Yes. Yeah.
Hi, Lisa Zaloga. So are all of the properties that are in the flood zone, do they all have an 80-foot front yard, or are there any that have less than an 80-foot front yard?
You got two mics.
Okay.
Don't leave it with her for too long.
I'm gonna.
I feel a little.
I don't sing, check.
I feel a little like Phil Donahue today.
The reason I'm asking is because you have the
These are
27-foot
examples.
front yard, front height, and you have the 33-foot, the 33-degree angle set 40 feet back from the street.
Right.
So if the house had a 60-foot front yard, then the house would not be able to be 27 feet tall. So is it one or the other, or whichever is greater, or what happens if the house only has a 60-foot front yard?
I'll give you an example. We did not go through every single lot through the entire study area to determine. We did averages. Okay, so we're basing our recommendations on averages at this point. When we get into the particulars of certain lot dimensions, what we found through our study area was we had narrow, long, narrow. We had average, wide enough, deep enough, and then we had other like this North Bayside, shallow lot. One of our recommendations is to reduce the front yard to 60 feet, so that you can still maintain the volume that would be similar.
So then you would.
So the character of the community would still remain the same.
So you would start the sky plane at 30 feet off of the street as opposed to 40 feet
Bingo.
off of the street. And could you just mention, you were talking about certain things being able to pierce the sky plane. What kind of things were you thinking?
I didn't bring examples of those, but primarily we're talking about dormers. Whether it be gable end or hip end or. But there would be maximum dimensions.
Yeah, I mean, actually,
no greater than this, no more than these, that type of recommendation.
Right.
So that it doesn't overburden the zoning board every time somebody wants to put in, when they want to pierce the sky plane and they want to put a dormer, if they have a half story, or even if they don't have a half story, but architecturally it makes sense.
And I would say it's not finished yet, but certainly if you think about, for example, the Village Center and the design guidelines, we talk about the ability to use features like that, but it's a certain percentage of the roof line that you can do that on. So you can use those features, but they're limited in scale.
But you don't know what that
And we don't know that yet.
Yeah, we're still working on that.
We're still working
on that.
But the idea is, again, we're trying to let people do what people have historically done here, which is houses that I would say are maybe, what's the right word, a little more expressive than they are in some other towns in the East End. Did you have a question?
No, I was going to wait till the sky plane conversation was over and then ask you to flip to the one that dealt with all
Sure.
sidewall dimension.
Sure.
Are you referring to this?
No, the articulation one that you,
That
Okay.
one or that one?
the first one you showed.
Okay. So,
I just wanted to see the dimensions on it.
We are, by the way, this is going to get posted on the village website,
Okay.
because we understand this is maybe a little hard for some of us whose eyesight is not quite as good as his to see.
generally speaking, we're talking about masses on the side yards of 30 feet in width,
Right.
and in the front 50.
Okay.
When we did a survey of homes and we looked at some of these very elegant homes, We saw a commonality of some of these very classical dimensions and scale. So 50 feet in the front yard for the width, Georgians and Federals and things like that. Whereas in the side yard, which is closer to your neighbor because of the 30-foot setback, the width of that mass got smaller to 30, and that's part of just recommendations at this point.
And the recommendation after that dimension is a 4-foot step
Yeah, the panels have to have a 4-foot step.
with no note as far as how far the break is.
I'm sorry?
Necessarily. I mean, right now you've got
The width of the break?
the width of the break.
Oh, we would get into percentage.
Okay.
And let me just say,
There's a
one of the
there's a lot of communities that have a lot of historic character that utilize these form-based dimensions that are pretty well vetted, and that this would be in character with that.
And let me just say that, if there are things you think that we've missed here or that things that would make this better, we'd love to hear that.
Please.
So please, in the next few weeks, please, give us your comments, because so the way we've done things over the last few years is we try to get a lot of comments, so by the time we get this to the trustees, it really reflects as much input as we can, so please.
Great.
I'm sure I'm 100% certain there were things that we missed here that could make it much better, so.
Some of the roof ideas,
Right.
that Lisa was
Right.
talking about, any
Right.
of those?
Yes.
And just being devil's advocate
Please.
again, now that we're going into the form, because that was my second part of my question too, with the larger lots, where there has not been a perceived problem, both of architecture or mass or anything else, because they are further back. Do you think we still should apply the form-based zoning to the larger lots as well, or should we maybe distinguish between large lots and smaller lots?
When we surveyed some of those large lots, there's a lot of contemporary homes on those long lots. A lot of these already have a lot of these facade breaks. A lot of them are, protected from the street by hedges and other things like that. So when you get right on the facade, you'll see, all these breaks. Now, it doesn't stop the fact that if there is Frank Gehry comes knocking and he wants to do what he wants to do, he's going to have to, if he wants relaxation on anything, he has to justify it like anybody of his caliber would.
Somebody who spends tens of millions of dollars for a house or for a lot, and he is not impacting anybody.
Right.
I find that
But that would be part
that
of.
you really should not be restricting him
Sure.
if he wants to do whatever he wants.
But that would be part of again, these are recommendations. The Planning Commission.
I think it's
Why-
kind of
you're
the
asking-
same question and the same answer.
Yeah.
Paul covered it before. but,
Yeah, so what we're really saying is, if you have a large lot and you end up putting your house in the middle of the lot, very, very little of this will ever apply to you. And that's fine, but I will tell you, right, what I will tell you, even very, very little, some of the form bases, but not a lot. But what I will say is, I could point out many examples of houses built in the last few years on large lots that come right up to their
Setback.
to their setback. So just the fact you have a large lot doesn't mean someone may decide for themselves the best place they want to put their house happens to be right next to their neighbor's house, so the rest of their lot is nice and clean. And I can show examples of that. So all we're saying is, whether you're in a large lot or a small lot, this is going to basically encourage you to put the house in the area and in the size that is least applicable in your neighbors.
I'm
Right.
not talking about the sky plane now, I'm talking about the form-based
Right.
architecture.
Sure.
You're talking about the facade articulation?
Not only the facade, but also the internal, because you're putting limits on the height of the walls, you're putting limits on the GFA.
Before they break.
Yeah.
Before they
break.
Yeah, you're
Right.
putting
We're not-
limits on the GFA.
We're not limiting GFA.
There's no effect of GFA on this.
You are by,
There is not.
I mean, it said it right in the presentation, you are by putting certain limits on the heights of the floor, or if you have a cathedral, it's counted twice.
No.
No.
You have limits
No.
on
No.
GFA.
Nope.
No.
No.
It's more how you use the space.
Right.
Yeah, I didn't say anything of that because that
Right.
wasn't part of the recommendations.
Right. Other
The-
questions?
Yeah, there is.
Is this all for only lots located in FEMA zones, or?
Correct. Right now, it's only for lots in the FEMA zones. We want to take care of that. it may be that we apply this elsewhere, but that's not for today, certainly. So for today, all we're looking at is what do we do within the FEMA zones? And the reason, obviously, is we have a crisis point in the FEMA zone because anybody, now as you know, building in the FEMA zone suddenly has a height that they didn't have before.
Let me just tack on
What the
to,
gentleman is trying to get at, and also
Right.
if I can, is that if you have a large lot, I think you can hear me, I'll be loud. You have a large lot on Meadow Lane, on the south side of Meadow Lane.
yeah.
And there's some large lots there,
Mhm.
and you're in a FEMA zone.
Mm-hmm.
You're being required to limit you're required to start a BFE +1 as opposed to at grade, which at grade over there is very high. Actually, in some cases, the VE zone.
Could you, actually, could you just, I want to understand, you just used a term. What do you mean by at grade?
Natural grade on the south side
Sure.
on Meadow Lane
Yeah.
is very high. And a lot of the areas in that, because of fill or because of different, they're actually in X zones. So instead of doing,
Would-
well, they are in X zones. They
What,
have,
which one is it? Give me, if you could give me, if you're talking about on Meadow, let me just give you, let me point out something. That map, FEMA is making changes to that map,
okay,
and I'll tell you why. When they took the topography, they didn't send, millions of surveyors to go around
they
with
use
stakes.
LiDAR.
They use LiDAR, thank you. I'm sorry, I don't know what you do
No,
for a
it's
living, so,
okay.
so they do LiDAR.
Mm-hmm.
There are gaps between one flood zone and another because the property was artificially raised
Mm-hmm.
around a house. The LiDAR would be able to take the roof out with the imagery, but then it doesn't, the software doesn't isolate the ground plane that's around it. So just because an island was built around a house doesn't mean it's out of the flood zone.
No, and just, and I hate to interrupt, but
okay.
my company, we actually went to the hearings that were held over here
Okay.
when
Oh,
FEMA
great.
changed them, and we spoke with FEMA representative
Okay.
as to why you could possibly even have an X zone
Mhm.
on Meadow Lane, because it's pretty much a barrier island. If you want
It's a gap in the mapping process.
Correct. So are you going to have then to answer the gentleman's question, you're talking about then pretty much everybody on every oceanfront lot, whether or not you're in an X zone because they're going to be changing, will be affected by this, correct?
Let me just make sure that because I've dealt with this as
Mm-hmm.
an applicant in other places, okay? I get a survey. The surveyor prepares it to the right datum. That's whether that town or village or whatever is their datum, which most of them are adopting 88 now as the datum for
correct.
vertical. Okay. They, if there is an inconsistency to a map, they're to ask the building code official or whomever is the coastal expert that the village either has in-house or may confer, or whatever the case may be, to confirm the zoning, the FEMA zone. It is up to them, since they are the manager of the adopted map, to say whether the property is the higher number all the way through, the lower number, because if there is a gap, an island that's in the middle of that property because the property was artificially, where that line matches, they're allowed to get rid of it. And then the map just has to go through, they're supposed to report it, so FEMA then can fix it on the map.
Loma.
And that's it, right, that's right, yeah. So they're supposed to be, I'll give you an example.
Well, I'll give you a quick example.
Sure.
If I have a client who's buying a property on the southern side
Sure.
of Meadow Lane, the property is zoned X, where the
Right.
building envelope is.
Um,
And it's
Can
on
you-
a survey. I'm just
Oh,
giving
yeah.
you, examples. There are examples of this.
yeah,
And I don't want to give out particular properties
that's fine,
because.
that's not a problem, that's not a problem,
But if the building envelope is X,
right.
that means I don't have to adhere to
No, that's
this.
incorrect, because
That's my question.
when the property has been raised,
No, but if it's already, it's
it has been raised.
not necessarily. There's some,
No, if it's already raised.
John, can you help me out a little bit on this?
Melissa, I've been over that with you before. The X zones do not exist. I won't accept them. They're VE.
Right,
okay.
Because just
Right.
as Mike said, they were raised artificially.
Right.
And the plane picks up that.
Okay, that's.
yeah, because,
all
and I
right.
think that,
fine.
part of our, part of our next steps aspect is about going through coastal construction standards and try to close up some of these gaps. Now, these gaps are not to make it more difficult. See, when a property is raised artificially, it's no longer natural.
No, I
Okay, so
understand.
Phil was
My
brought
question
in to-
was answered. Thank you.
Yeah, okay,
Okay.
okay. Sorry.
Yes, I'm just wondering, in the town of Southampton, what the sky exposure plane is for in the coastal zones, or the equivalent coastal zone? What's the angle of that sky exposure plane?
Way back.
It's not on.
Did they have it?
Maybe in the diagram.
45 degrees. 45 degrees.
That BFE plus 2.
Plus 2. It starts at plus 2.
Right.
We're at 31.
What was it?
Plus 1 at 30.
45?
Has anyone just looked at the difference in that?
We did look at it. Yeah, we did look at it. On the larger lot, though, difference from your town center, that's right. You have the opportunity to put the house further in from the property.
But the town of Southampton will never be hit. It's VE plus 2 at 45, right?
Not for building height. No, not for measurement of building height.
They were more restrictive.
They're more restrictive.
Right,
That's
they're more restrictive.
Yeah, I just want
That's
to,
where the,
let me just make sure. Here's ground.
Yeah. But it's because of the cap, it's not because of the...
The cap reduces the building
Right,
mass.
correct.
Because where it's measured from natural, and there's no adjustment due to flood zone. And that's actually the most common thing out here.
They'll be in
Yeah.
trouble soon.
Yeah, and just let me say, one thing, and we have given more thought about it probably than it appears tonight. If you look, for example, in the village of Sagaponic, they have a very strict height restriction, and what they're getting, which is nothing wrong with it, it's just different, is they're getting modern flat roof house after modern flat roof house. So what's happening is everybody in every town is filling out their envelope in whatever way they can, and what tends to happen when you set it by pure height is everyone builds big fat houses, and whether those are good or bad, those are different than historically we've had on Meadow and Gin Lane. So, other questions? Susan.
Hi, Susan Stevenson. I live in the village. In terms of, I commend you for the idea that there should be a uniform situation here. The contentiousness that's gone on and the sort of guessing game and experts versus experts has been really unpleasant, expensive, and I think perhaps unnecessary. I wonder what your recommendations are for the actual application process, because I think some of the worst examples of what's happening here or will happen had to do with variances that were allowed that cut back the side yards on a lot of these properties. So a lot of what you presented here doesn't hold for them because they've got these walls and little planter things and 6 feet off the limit. And I would hope that there would be some streamlining or accountability so that the people the applicants do not appear with already some kind of a incredible windfall of the use of the land. And I'd also like to say that I do not think that how much you paid for your property has anything to do with this. I paid plenty for my property 25 years ago or whatever it was, and I find it valuable. And so unless the village is protected, my investment in this village goes down. So I really resent the fact of anyone saying, somebody spent X dollars on a beachfront piece of property. We all live here. This is the village of Southampton, and it should be respected. Thanks.
So I heard 3 things.
Okay.
I
was trying to count too.
Yeah,
but
I think I heard 3 things. Streamlining of the process for predictability is its own animal, and that we're going to work with John so we can understand the nature of the way the applications come in. We're going to help them develop standards so the package at the front desk, when somebody wants to start a house, they understand better of what the conformity of that package, how it has to look. Not design of the house, but like the cover sheet that says how you comply with the village code, makes it easier to review, makes it easier to design, makes it more predictable. When something's more predictable, it takes theoretically less time to review. It doesn't get knocked around to get opinions from this board and that board and this board and that board, unless that's the path that the applicant wants to take. They have every right to ask for every variance in the world like anybody else, and it is up to the community and the board that they're asking for relief from to evaluate the merits of what they're requesting relief from. That process is never going to change. It is a right in state law, and it's a right that is kind of inbred into property development. What is mine kind of type of thing. Zoning is zoning and good zoning, and the transition towards form-based zoning is more community-oriented. okay? It's trying to keep neighbors friendly with neighbors. Or when they want relaxation, they're requesting more relaxation than what is currently on the books. So from the predictability standpoint and the application process, that is something that is completely outside of dealing with building height and massing and things like that. Understanding the recommendations, whatever does get adopted and written in, we'll work with John and staff on streamlining the process so it's easier both from the homeowner side, the professional side, as well as once it comes in, for the staff to work with and the boards to review. Then the last part, we were not given any instructions about whether somebody spent X amount of dollars or Y or whatever, because the uniformity, again, being on the applicant side, you weigh what the municipality will allow you to do without relaxation, and you help the client develop what their needs are. And it's that balance of going back and forth to try to find what works, that you have a happy homeowner that feels that they have a house that they're proud of, whether the house is big or small or contemporary or whatever it might be. It's that balance. So the predictability of the application process helps the professional endlessly, truthfully. It makes it easier to tell your client, if we do this, if we do this, if we do this, I'm giving you what you want. You have the room that you want. You have the view that you want. You have the windows that you want. And we don't have to go for a variance. And that'll save X amount of time from the application process. You'll have everything you want, everything you'll ever need. And hopefully that'll also take a certain percentage of the clients to go, I love it. Hopefully. And there are some people that will always want more, and that's okay. And that's not unique to this neighborhood
I think
either.
the other thing I would say, which I think is really important and I think has mostly worked, nothing is ever perfect, but has mostly worked in the small lots, is people who are buying a piece of property will understand up front what the ground rules are. Mm-hmm. And what they can and can't do. And so what happens now very often, because of the way the current code works, which is almost not relevant in many ways to the realities of those sites, is it's a fairly political process, if you will, with a small p, to sort of figure out what you'll end up being able to do. That's what we're trying to change, so that in the future, someone buys a lot in the ocean, they'll know pretty much up front what they can and can't build. And my guess is they'll be fine, and there'll be I would hope and expect that there'll be very few cases that we'll be hearing about. But part of what we're also trying to do here is I'm assuming the FEMA rules can change next year or in 5 years as storms happen. And so we're trying as best we can to come up with zoning that is not only related to the FEMA rules today. Because what we've seen, obviously, in the last few years is the FEMA rules changed and really made much of the zoning not work anymore. So we're trying to come up with something that will work as the FEMA rules change, as much as we can. Yeah. So unless there are other...
Paul, just one real quick thing.
And let me go to Bill first. Yes.
Just one quick question, Bill Hattrick.
Bill.
I know you're concentrating on the FEMA zones. What percentage of the village landmass is in the FEMA zones? Do you have any idea? I mean, just a rough guess. Yeah, does anybody? John?
We didn't look at that at all.
No, the only reason I bring it up
at our study area
is because as important as the FEMA zones are,
sure, and
we've had a lot of contentiousness involving them, I'm very concerned about what I assume is the other 85% of the village.
Sure.
And I hope you're not going to stop at this.
That
Reassure
could be
me,
a comment
please.
given. If you feel that there are some of the ideas that we've expressed tonight should be adopted elsewhere, because you already have Skyplane elsewhere in the village?
Yeah, so let me, Mr. Hattrick, I absolutely agree with you. I think we think this obviously is a crisis that has to be addressed immediately. But I think what we are seeing here, I would hope, is some tools that we might decide we're going to use elsewhere.
Universally.
Correct.
Great, thanks.
So, any other questions before we close?
Just an understanding question.
Yeah.
Sorry to drag everybody out. Yeah, well, I'm trying really hard. My apologies for that. I think I understand the height. I think I'm just going to play this back and you can say it. I think the height is probably, the maximum height is probably 1 foot less than I think John was interpreting it previously. But what I think you're also saying is that's more than compensated for because you're considering mass and you're considering that by, amongst other things, side backs and facade breaks and all of that stuff. What I just don't understand yet is the side yard setback. I think one of the reasons in the FEMA zones you didn't need a setback, a sky plane, was because under the current zoning laws it was impossible to hit it. You've got 30-foot minimum, and you can't go to the height forever there because there is actually a roof slope as well, and there's a maximum 35 feet off grade. If you add all of that together, it's impossible to hit a 45-degree sky plane from ground. And we could go through the math later, but what I'm trying to understand is what's the new side yard setback sky plane, and I could probably see it if I could read your numbers.
Well, this is what you have.
I think it was there was another chart that you had with the side yard setbacks on. And is it 33%? Is it 45%? Is it what's the minimum setback, side yard setback?
It is 30. It is still 33, but there's a 5-foot leg before the 33.
So it's 5 feet. So it's 33 degrees
at the property line.
Yeah.
5 feet.
Right.
And then 33 degrees.
And it's the setback is still 30 feet.
That is correct.
Okay. Now I understand.
That is correct.
Thanks.
Now I just want to stress that the issue of the way things are right now, back to, okay, right there could be the peak of the face of a gable. So it's not, the ridge could be at 52 feet, 30 feet away from the neighbor. That's what we're talking about.
Yeah, which is not.
Which is big.
Stop right there. I like that.
Right. Okay. So I think I'm gonna close it there. So first of all, as we said, this is all going to be on the village website. We really need comments. We really need your input. Mr. Mayor, do you want to say anything before we close?
Just
Yes. He doesn't really need a microphone.
There you go.
We're going to get a real close-up, Mark.
There you go, exactly. Yes. Yeah, employee of the month, exactly. So, first of all, I commend the Planning Commission for the work that you guys have done, and also Nelson Pope and Voorhees and Mike and what you've done. And I think what we're going to accomplish here is, because for me, I love the architecture down there, and I really don't want to see flat-roofed homes on stilts. And that's not what the Village of Southampton's all about. And I hope that at the end of the day, we're going to see is really good standards that are going to help people design the homes that are really what we're really proud of, to drive through the estate section and see the variety of architecture, the incredible roof lines. That's what we're all about here. And I think that this is moving in the right direction. I'm very happy about this. And I think we'll get some very good positive feedback from people. Even we'll get some negative feedback, which is good too. But again, this is part of just a small tip of things. We're going to continue with this. We've got other things we have to work on. Billy, you'd mentioned about that. We're going to take and look at certain things that are going on throughout the entire village. And Chick, we talked about that on Monday, about it, continuing to study and stuff. So this is a great opportunity for us, and I thank everybody for coming out here tonight, and all the village board is here, and just to let you guys know how important that is for everybody. So thanks, guys, for everything.
We're going to close the meeting. We will obviously be talking about this at the Planning Commission meeting at the beginning of February, and talk a little bit about the comments that we got. So, thank you.